Okay, so continuing on talking about homelessness from my own experiences, I decided to define homelessness, which led me to researching into it. And an article titled The Relationship Between Community Investment in Permanent Supportive Housing and Chronic Homelessness by Brian Cullen, Fargo, Montgomery, and Moley in 2014 found that according to the federal definition shared by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, a chronically homeless person is an unaccompanied homeless individual with a disabling condition or an adult member of a homeless family who has a disabling condition who has either been continuously homeless for a year or more or has had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. And then another study by Lee Tyler Wright in 2010 titled The New Homelessness Revisited found that many studies have followed Rossi in defining homelessness as not having customary and regular access to conventional dwelling. The McKinley Veto Homelessness Assistance Act, a key piece of federal legislation, offers a housing-based definition similar to Rossi's, in that it refers to the absence of an adequate nighttime residence, but also specifies physical presence in selected locations, shelters, institutional settings, and places not intended for human habitation, as sufficient condition to establish one's homelessness. And then also, since homelessness does not include adult males and females, it's important to take note of the children. In an article done by Day, Fowler, Landsberg, Markel, and Zhang in 2019 titled Defining Homelessness and the Transition to Adulthood for Policy and Prevention, it mentioned that the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which was in 2008, that outlines eligibility for services through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, defines youth homelessness as the inability of accompanied adolescents under age 21 to live safely with a relative. And this was found on page 3052. And then Lee's was found on page 503, and Brian's was pages 234 to 235. It's important to note when talking about the children that how it mentioned age under 21. So that includes like a large quantity of kids, if you really think about it. And then I decided to touch on the reasons for homelessness. So an article titled Structural Determinants of Homelessness in the United States, done in 1991 by Elliott and Carvo on pages 114 to 115, found that 4 structural factors are most commonly cited as the major causes of homelessness. 1, which is the lack of low-cost housing. 2, high poverty rates. 3, poor economic conditions. And 4, lack of community mental health care facilities. And it just touched on one a little bit more, which was the first one, lack of low-cost housing. A lack of low-cost housing is the most obvious cause of high level of homelessness. Without available or affordable housing, some people will live with relatives or friends, thereby increasing the level of household doubling. Others, especially with those with weaker or less resourceful social networks, will not find a home at all. Decreases in the supply of low-cost housing since at least 1970 suggests that a shortage in affordable housing plays an important role in explaining high levels of homelessness. So basically, housing is a large problem. No matter where you go in America, it's still a large issue. And then as for the history of homelessness, this was found in an article titled The Impact of Homelessness and Shelter Life on Family Relations on page 243, done by Lindsay in 1998, found that the first wave of family homelessness that began in the 1980s has been attributed to federal cuts in housing programs, loss of privately owned low-income housing stock, the failure of public assistance benefits to keep pace with inflation, increased rate of divorce, and failure of courts to enforce child support orders. Recent changes in welfare programs threaten to create a second wave of family homelessness. With public assistance no longer an entitlement and benefits limited to 2 to 5 years, depending on the state, it is likely that the number of homeless families will increase, especially when the economy takes its next downturn and recent hires lose their jobs. Without the safety net, families will find it harder to emerge from homelessness, and the length of time families are homeless is likely to increase. In addition, the absence of benefits may well precipitate some families into homelessness who would otherwise have managed to maintain their own residencies. So basically, in short, homelessness can be heavily attributed to government funding issues, and then we need these benefits for these families to be able to successfully thrive, and without these benefits, we're just causing more people to become homeless, which is like a large problem. Okay, and I decided to also tackle statistics about homelessness. I figured it'd be helpful to have like a full background before discussing like why it's such a prevalent problem. So, an article titled Life Shocks and Homelessness by Corman, Curtis, Noonan, and Richmond in 2013 found that homelessness is a significant and often glaring social problem in the United States, particularly in urban areas. The magnitude is difficult to quantify because the homeless are underrepresented in household-based surveys. There is no standard methodology for counting the homeless, and homelessness is often a transient state. So basically, it's really hard to do research on homeless because it's hard to get enough people to be able to answer surveys, and since they don't have phones, there's really no way how to properly track them or to send out surveys like homes like they normally would do. In 2019, the Council of Economic Advisors did a file called The State of Homelessness in America, and they found that in January 2018, 500,052 and 30 people were counted as homeless in the United States. Of those, 100,094,467, 35% were unsheltered, and 358,363, 65% were sheltered. The overall homeless population on a single night represents 0.2% of the United States populations, or 17 people per 10,000 in the population. And then specifically in Muncie, I found a actual research done by people from Ball State. So Bishop, Hiddle, Kelly, and Clole in 2004, titled Muncie Homelessness Study, found that the number of homelessness in Muncie, Indiana, based on estimation strategies utilized by HUD, the population should be in the range of 65 to 250 persons. The survey was completed by 104 individuals. These individuals reported having 70 children with them. This brings the total homeless population for the survey to 174. Based on previous test surveys, it is estimated that the population increases approximately 20% in the winter. The winter estimate would be around 210 individuals. Muncie is at the highest end of HUD's estimation range, 250 persons. It is estimated the total number of homeless in Muncie is between 175 to 210 persons, which is honestly a lot. And then there's a demographic breakdown for the United States. I found in a webpage called The State of Homelessness that most people experiencing homelessness are individuals, 67% at least. The remaining 33% are people in families with children. Public policy has put a focus on additional subpopulations. So one of the subpopulations is youth who are under the age of 25 and living on their own without parents or children. This group is 7% of the total homeless population. In recent years, coordinated efforts at all levels of government have also targeted veterans, which are 7% of the total homeless population, and chronically homeless people, 18%. This last group consists of people with disabilities who have been homeless for an extended period of time or repeatedly. And then gender and racial demographics are an important part of the American homelessness story. The homeless population is largely male. Among individual adults, 70% are men. White Americans are the largest racial grouping, accounting for 49% of those experiencing homelessness. However, African Americans and American Indians are dramatically overrepresented in the point-in-time count compared to their numbers in the general population. So basically, all people can potentially be homeless regardless of race or gender or age. And then there's a demographic breakdown for Muncie. This is still the same study that I referred to earlier by Bishop, Hiddle, Kelly, and Cole in 2004, titled Muncie Homelessness Study. They found, this was 2004, keep in mind, that children dominate the homeless population, representing 40% of the survey population. Women represent 37% of the population, and men represent 23%. The racial diversity of homeless population represents slightly more minorities than it does the population of Muncie generally. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the Muncie population is 86% white, 11% black, and 3% other. Age. The homeless population ranges from 18 to 86 years of age. It is fairly evenly distributed across all age groups from 18 to 65. The smallest group are the elderly, 65 plus. This may be due to access to Social Security, Medicare, and pensions. These would provide a steady stream of income and form of safety net when medical crises emerge. And then it also went on to mention marital status. Only about 20% of the homeless are married. Of the remaining 80% or more than half are divorced or separated. Singles make up about a third of the homeless population. And disabilities, nearly half, 49% of the homeless report having some level of disability. This is a particularly large number and may provide some insight into why individuals in Muncie become homeless. Okay, and so then specifically for this project, the systems of oppression that the homeless face could be classism, racism, and sexism to some extent. I went ahead and listed out all the definitions from our text by Hayes and Erford. This book was from 2018. And our text is titled Developing Multicultural Counseling Competence, a Systems Approach. And this is all found on page 97. Racism is defined as an ongoing, multidimensional, and dynamic process inherent in the development and maintenance of an institutionalized hierarchical racial classification system. And then there's also individual racism, which is personal attitudes and beliefs in white superiority and the inferiority of people of color with physical differences among individuals used an explanation of social, moral, and intellectual behavior. Institutional racism, which is a differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. And structural racism, which emphasizes that the oppression of racial and ethnic groups originating with the social construct of race and racial classification systems is organized by institutional, cultural, and social structures. And then next is sexism, which was defined by Hayes and Erford in 2018 on page 128 as sexism as a system of oppression based on sex, gender identity, and gender expression. And then male privilege is unearned rights and societal benefits afforded to men solely based on their sex assignment. And then next is classism. Classism, as defined by Hayes and Erford on page 195, is having negative biases about and discriminatory behaviors towards individuals or groups based on their perceived or actual socioeconomic status. And then there's internalized classism, which refers to unexamined class biases that shape our beliefs about ourselves and our relative merit in our families, peer groups, and communities. And then structural classism, which refers to social and institutional practices that discriminate on the basis of socioeconomic status. And so then I decided to tackle oppression applied to groups. So this one I applied classism. Those who are in poverty are normally of the lower class, so they may face classism and discrimination because of it. It is also very hard to break the chains of poverty and to break the generational cycle of poverty. And clearly, if they have negative beliefs about themselves or others around them have negative beliefs about themselves, it would definitely push the idea of classism. And if they're poor, they would probably most likely think more negatively about themselves. And then the next one is oppression applied to individuals. Here I specifically applied racism and sexism. Racism, our text specifically mentioned that Hayes and Erford in 2018 on page 123 said that people of color receive disproportionate incomes and job opportunities in comparison to their white counterparts. And then I said if people of color are less likely to receive the same job opportunities or have the same incomes, they may be more likely to be homeless. So basically, no job, no home. And then sexism, I specifically looked at the Muncie mission only offers housing to males currently, but both men and women face sexism. And it's also important to note in Muncie that there are different opportunities and sources out there for women. So like they could be in the Better Way, which is a domestic violence shelter for women. So that does offer shelter to women. and their families. And then both racism and sexism could lead to children being kicked out of their households and then them becoming homeless. And then acceptance is very important to preventing homelessness, because we've all heard stories about children coming out to their parents as being on the LGBTQ scale, the LGBTQ plus. And then if their families do not accept them, they could be kicked out. And it's more common than not nowadays, which is sad. But it's important to keep note when talking about the homeless. And then other issues that the homeless may face may be stigmas, prejudice, discrimination, society mistrust, harassment, language barriers, economic hardships, and microaggressions. For stigmas, there's definitely a lot of stigma surrounding the homeless, that they're dirty, that they're lazy, that they're just unwanted in society, and this could be really harmful to their mental health. Also, there's a lot of stigma surrounding mental health, and since there's so many stigmas surrounding it, people are less likely to go to receive help. And instead of receiving help, they let their mental illness take control, and this could cause them to have depression or to allow their depression to fully take effect on their life. It's also terrible to see that there's a lot of people who are homeless that do have mental illnesses, and that instead of our society addressing these mental illnesses and stigmas, they still push them out. And it's also very common that you see homelessness walk hand in hand with the criminal justice system, because a lot of people who have these mental illnesses could also end up in our prisons and jails, and that these stigmas can also force homeless not to want to receive help. That there are social services out there, but stigmas are definitely terrible and force people not to want to receive help. There's definitely prejudice. People hold their own prejudice against the homeless, once again referring back to how they're lazy, or that they don't want jobs, or they don't believe that the homeless are it's their choice. They believe that the homeless want to be homeless, which is not true. They face discrimination. Once again, people think that they're lazy or that they're homeless for a reason, so if they go to apply for a job, they might not receive the job. Also, discrimination just with how people treat them within society. The next point is society mistrust. So since society doesn't really trust the homeless, they believe and push out the ideas and the stereotypes that they would steal, that they don't have jobs, and that they might turn to stealing in order to benefit themselves or to provide for themselves. They face harassment because some people are just honestly rude and they don't want to help support them, or instead of giving them money, they turn to harassing them. Language barriers. If a homeless member is from a different culture or from a different race, they may speak a different language than us, and that could become a problem because if a person's speaking Spanish and in Muncie, they might not be able to receive the help that they need because no one around them can understand them. Economic hardships. The homeless definitely face economic hardships. They don't receive the support from society, and they're not receiving the help, and they might not know how to receive the help or where to find help. And then microaggressions. It's just definitely followed through with the prejudice and discrimination, that society just does not help them whatsoever and would rather force stigmas and stereotypes against them. And then what we can do to help: be mindful, be human, be nice, be caring, donate if you can, spend time with them, realize that they're people too, and constantly push the idea that you don't know why they're homeless and that you can always be able to help them. And just be human, be nice. It's just not that hard. And these men, you don't understand their stories and where they're coming from, so constantly be mindful that because you don't understand, don't try to judge them and try to be as supportive as possible. And okay, say if a homeless member is asking for food or money, you could give them food. You can always be supportive and helpful even if you're not giving them money. And that's really important to keep note of.